Heel top.
Alright. Ben je zit erin, Marlijn?
Ja?
Ja.
Well, hello. Welcome everyone to the last workshop of today, or workshop. I would rather say it's a short presentation by Stijn and me, or I will give the presentation and then we have the Q&A with Ben Bot, and that will be moderated by Stijn. But first, welcome to A Guide for Leaving a Dictatorship. The question we are trying to answer today is, how do you get rid of someone that doesn't want to leave? And as you can see in the background, there's already some Belarusian stuff going on, and that is indeed the case that we will discuss. But first, introduction. So I am Marlijn, and I'm here together with Stijn. Stijn, can you wave?
Yes, hello.
Yes, and we are both public administration students for the master at Leiden University, and we are really interested in democracy in itself, so that's why we're here. And today's session is thus divided in 3 parts. We have first a step-by-step guide for leaving a dictatorship, around 20 minutes, and then there's some room for discussion on how to leave a dictatorship, and then we will have the Q&A with Ben Bot. So thank you all for being here, and I hope you enjoy this step-by-step guide. Well, the case, as this will make it a lot easier to see what's going on, is Belarus. Some background information. We have the current president of Belarus is Alexander Lukashenko. He is the president since 1996 or 1994. Yes, 1994. I'm sorry for this mistake. And elections were held on Sunday, the 9th of August this year. So it's already 3 months now. And he had a first opposition that he accepted in all of these years was a formed opposition of 3 women that we see in this picture here. And these are all wives of former opponents of Lukashenko that he dismissed, so to say, or got detentioned, or they're gone at least. He got them out of the way. And he wasn't expecting these women to make such a strong statement, because they were able to combine all the opponents of Lukashenko together. Yes, so step 1 for this guide for leaving a dictatorship, elections. Well, first, I'm sorry. We would like to set an ideal on what we would like to have after the elections. In most cases, it's about democracy or less corruption or human rights or something like that, something that's completely going wrong. And then you need to find a program that connects the opponents of the dictator. That is exactly what has happened in Belarus. And if this is not happening, it's really hard to get a majority on your stance against the dictator. So what these women did in Belarus is really extraordinary, and also something that made their success such great, or at least now they have people protesting. And then you have to promote your program, just as we see in this picture here, and you have to call people to go voting, something that we've also seen in American elections and has been discussed by Tanya this early afternoon. The second step is, okay, now we have the results after the elections, and they are completely wrong, according to the opposition. In most cases, it's because the results are too high to be reasonable. So in the case of Lukashenko, it was about 80% that he told his people that voted in favor of him. But a lot of people didn't believe that, because they didn't know people that voted for Lukashenko. So that is one of the reasons why they were not accepting these results. It is a completely other thing to say, okay, so then we have the other party that wins. There's a difference between those two things. One of the reasons why the results were not accepted in the international community is because there was no international press or control allowed in this situation. So no one knows if there was fraud or whatever, but there have been some images on the internet that may look like there was fraud. And one of the other things that they're not accepting is the fleeing to another country or place or taking custody of the opposition, as we have seen also with this woman. There's only one woman left, Maria, and she is the one that is still protesting, but the others have flown to Lithuania and are taken in custody. So that's also a signal from the dictator to the opposition. Then the third step is protest. Well, as we see in this image here, that is still going on. This is from the 14th of August, but these protests are still weekly going on. And one of the main things to keep the people on your side is to do it peacefully. Because if you use any violence, then people will stop having your support in this. And it makes also the bridge bigger between the military or the police and the peaceful protesters. Then the fourth step that I think we are sort of right in now is media influence. So we see in Belarus, especially the use of media as a weapon. So for example, we see this picture here with the bare back of someone that has been, has had a lot of violence from the police because there were a lot of people released from prison and then they came out with wounds like this. And this is also marked as violence against human rights because you cannot torture people. And this is where the international community is going to start in on this protest. And especially with the violation of human rights, it becomes an international problem. And as we said, let your ideal be heard. Ideally, it's democracy, especially if you're in Europe, because the EU has the task to promote democracy. So if you have an opposition that is pro-democracy, then it will give you a lot of rights already. And I would really like to point out that the media is the way to move your internal state conflict towards an international community, and that it also demands from states and institutions to respond to this. Thus, the EU has to respond to this kind of human rights violations and has to respond to Lukashenko getting all the opposition in custody. And that is something that they really struggle with. And that's why we have step 5, they keep going, because there's still protests going on in Belarus at this moment. And they're still keeping it peaceful, as we can also see here. So we see that there's a really big difference between the armored police and militaries and the bare people. And still, these people are also asking for a response from the international community. And this is where the longer it takes, the more the international community has to respond. So one of the things that is now going on in the EU is what has happened is that all the funding of the EU is being put on hold for Lukashenko, and all his fellow members and himself cannot travel inside the European Union. So these are the sanctions that the EU really tries to do, but they have to be really careful with that, because on the other side of Belarus, you have Russia, and Russia is the ally of Lukashenko at this point. So, and what you would really like to prevent is a military conflict. So I hope with this, you get a feeling of why it is so hard to put sanctions also from the EU, and why it is hard for the international community to respond to this kind of situation that are so close to us. I don't know, Stijn, do you have anything to add to this?
No, actually, I fully agree with what you're saying.
Good.
I don't have anything to add to this. Yes.
Yeah. So we just wanted to point out that it's really complex to think of the right thing to do in this situation, and that's why also the step 6 is not really that's going on right now in Belarus. This is already an interesting picture because this woman over here is 73 years old. So you see again the difference between the military and the people that are protesting in the streets. But one of the, I think, the weirdest advices that there are is don't execute your dictator. Because if you, in the future, hopefully Lukashenko will not be there. And if they execute them or put them in custody or whatever, there will be a power vacuum. Well, what is a power vacuum? It's a condition that exists when someone has lost control of something and no one has replaced them. So if there's no replacement for Lukashenko, you will have, for example, military coup or a coup d'etat or other people that are jumping in to get the position of Lukashenko. And they don't have, and then you don't have a democracy in the end, or to get rid of the dictator, you just go from one dictator to the other. And there has been research done, especially in African countries, where there's a big amount of people switching from one like dictator to the other. So with this power vacuum, the risk is higher to have this and to not get rid of any dictator at all. And I think that's also really interesting. So what should we do with Lukashenko then? Because he definitely did something wrong. And there are also solutions about this, but this is too long for this presentation, but it's really interesting to take a look into. And then the step 7, that how do you prevent this power vacuum, is then to have a plan as an in-between. And that is something that this woman really did. They presented their program as, okay, so we just want to get elected for the coming 6 months. Then we can set up free and fair elections, and then we will do it again. We don't want to be in the politics. We just want to get rid of Lukashenko. And then you can vote again for a parliamentary system and with other parties and all that kind of stuff. So your first concern is to removing the authoritarian leader in this situation, in this case, Lukashenko. And the second is the prevention of this power vacuum. And I think why this situation could be successful for Belarus is thus because they have a plan for this. That is also really in detail and is a promise that they will have to keep. And of course, it's always the question if they do so, but as these women are not political people from themselves, probably they will. So that makes it a good point. And then the other next one is the new elections. And these are needed to establish the democracy. It's even worse, so to say, because you need 2 rounds of free and fair elections to be counted as democracy according to the FIDEM index. And even then, when you have free and fair elections, there are different levels of democracy. And I think that is also what we have seen in the last, in these workshops and in these talks that we had today, that there are different ways of setting up your democracy. And there's an index for this. There's no right or wrong. You could do that, but that would be a normative argument for it. But there are differences in it. And I think something that's also really important, as we said with the step 4 and 5, is that you find alliances in the national community. So if these women in the end grasp the power, then it would be good for them to think about a way to also have Russia on their side and also have the EU on their side and not pick one of 2, but have alliances in the surrounding countries. Yes, I think that's it. And my question to you is, what ideas do you have to get rid of your dictator? If you have some, please let me know. I would be really interesting to see, because these 7, 8 steps are the 7, how do you say this, criteria for democracy. They are in it, but I thought this would be an easy way for you to remember what a democracy should be. I cannot see the chat. So are there questions in the chat?
No, not yet. Not yet.
How would you get rid of your dictator, Stijn?
Well, what I think is very interesting is that I think a big problem here is that Russia and, as you mentioned, Russia and China are very much allied with Belarus. They have also a lot of, as I think China does often, is they sort of give a lot of financial support to countries. So they have a sort of dependency strategy. So I think what EU has done multiple times in the past is they've tried to sort of give like these incentives to Lukashenko and say like, okay, if you like give a little more space to your media or to your civil society, then we will give you this and this and this. But because there's this, because Russia and China are already so influenced, this often didn't really work, as that's what I understood from when I looked into this case. So I think that is a very problematic issue that Russia and China have a lot of influence. So what I sort of suggested is that EU also builds up more financial relations with Belarus in order to leverage that in the future. But that is also, of course, you can argue that that's a bit of a you can also say that, okay, then aren't you just rewarding Lukashenko with this? So that's also maybe a bit of a tricky thing. And also it's really, sorry, I'm talking.
Yeah, I think you can also think about sanctions and also funding, for example, for civil initiatives instead of giving it to the government.
No, I also didn't mean the government, but more businesses, and then from then on, sort of have it from build. But what's also a big problem is that Lukashenko often denies funding from the EU to, for example, NGOs. So he also cuts these things off as well. So there have been some fundings, but often they've also been denied. So that's also a big issue, because obviously, for you guys, civil society is pretty important to get sort of opposition towards an authoritarian regime.
Yes.
Yeah. But if anyone has any other ideas, I'm also interested in hearing it.
Well, hello again, everyone. I was waiting for Stijn to intervene, to say something, to intervene, because I thought that this would his idea. Yes, I share with you the whole idea and everything you said. But there is something very dangerous here I would like to say. So as I traveled and have been to many countries, so including Belarus, that was one of the complicated countries for me just to go through. Belarus to Russia or to other countries. So in the airport, because they have very strict rules. Yes, they have Chinese and Russian as main languages. So in the administration, inside, they don't believe in English at all. The point that I would like just here to address regarding the dictatorship in Belarus or other countries, once we have a dictator, we need to look back in his background or in his career. So there are people that are pushing this dictatorship just to help him stay, to cover their mistakes or to cover maybe their problems, because they were working as a team before for ages. So I think Belarus has this president who is very old and who cannot commit to the commitments of the country and what's going on now since ages for more than 26 years. This is the question that I would like just to add here. Following the steps of Martin to get rid of dictatorship, I think this is a great presentation for everyone, following just the steps. There is just another thing regarding the financial steps. How would Belarus benefit from the European Union and from both sides, Russia and the European Union, to avoid being in the same situation of Ukraine and to avoid being the same or the new point of conflict in Europe? I don't think that the Belarusian dictatorship, well, this is my point of view, will end up soon, and I don't think that this president will leave Belarus in peace. and I don't think that the three women that are interested so in the Belarusian so election, so as Martin so mentioned before, are experts so in this field. I think that there should be a new implementation, new plan for this. So by the European Union, they should help the situation and prevent the problems before they get serious later. Of course, Belarus is one of the biggest friends of Russia and of course China. And it's not for me a European Union country, or it's not Europe so at all. They have so Soviet Union rules. They still so in the Soviet Union so community. There are different rules there. Human rights there are different like the European ones that we have here. Yes, to get rid of the dictatorship, this is a point that we need to discuss more about by hearing the other opinions. Yeah.
But are you aware that like the reason why it's still a Soviet country is because Lukashenko is still in power?
It's really
because he has put all the laws and all the judges and the whole system. He has made it after a Soviet ideal. So you could say that if you find other people doing that, then you could, for example, not have a completely democratic part, but you could still, that will take time, of course. You will not become a democracy overnight, and that's also, I think, something that I really wanted to point out. But I think with other leaders, there could be big changes, but they will take time.
What I see here is that Belarus is a very frightening country, not just for Europe, but it's for itself, because economically, regarding some of my research, it's in a huge crisis. This president really destroyed its democracy, destroyed so its maybe free population to be well heard so in the world. He implemented a very strong system just for him and for his government. Once he leaves the government, Belarus will never need maybe change. It will remain in the same situation. The problem is that Belarus will be a new crisis of Europe economically. I would like to talk about the financial points. And I don't think that the European Union will be able to finance so all the crisis that will be happening so in the upcoming years, especially now. Not only Belarus, we have so many countries that are suffering during the pandemic period. Yes, and I think that there should be a dialogue with this president, so they can elaborate maybe a new system, a new election. He has to understand that he cannot lead anything in his country. Because he is old, he has to leave his post of president to other young leaders. He has to prepare new leaders. The new thing that I have to focus on here is the dialogue between Europe and Lukashenko. Before Russia will go to a dialogue with Lukashenko to put another one in his position. This is my point.
But I think that's also something that Stijn also wanted to point out with the financial support.
I think you can also say that because it's in such an economic crisis, that maybe this can be useful for the EU, sort of, or maybe also can be a useful thing that there's, because, well, it's obviously awful, but there can be, because of these economic crises, there can be, there's more anger, there's more resistance to Lukashenko. I was looking at the chat box. There was a question that, do you think Lukashenko will step down without an organized militant force stepping down? I think that's very interesting because, and another one also asked, isn't the easiest way to just sway the existing military to your side? That's very interesting. Sorry, you can answer.
If you want, you can also do it if you want.
Okay. What I think is that Lukashenko has quite a lot of close people to him that have been tried to been persuaded in the past, I believe. But he has a very close circle of people that are sort of really standing by him and supporting him. So it's quite. I'm not sure that this will work to get the military on your side, but it's a very interesting idea, and I also don't think that he will step down very soon without this organized militant power, because it has been. This man has been in power for more than 20 years. He has been, sort of. There's been the EU has tried a lot of times in the past, so it's also very difficult. But I'm also very curious as what Mr. Bot will say about all this in a few minutes. So
Yeah, and I think that's also something that is not in this presentation of the steps, the military change. But I think from the images we can see that the military is still on Lukashenko's side. And according to experts, that's also the main reason why there is still no coup, why it's still only protest. Because if you have the military on your side and takes upon Lukashenko, you will also have weapons and you will also have his biggest alliance. But as Stijn also pointed out, like when you're in office for more than 20 years, you've had a lot of possibility to persuade anyone to be on your side. And I think also the part of that is that the economic crisis is also a reason why people would really like to keep their job and not really wanting to give it up for protest, because that is their first concern, is to still have an income. So that's also becoming a problem right now with the ongoing protest. So the chance for a power vacuum is really high, because if Lukashenko leaves, he will leave with a lot of other people. And the question is if these women, if there are still then the people to do that, would be the ones would be good enough to fill this gap.
I agree.
That's something that I think we'll see in the future.
Yeah, can I shortly, because I see that Mr. Bot has entered entered the discussion.
I think that's also a good closure.
So Mr. Bot, thank you very much for attending this meeting. We are very honored to have you here. I'll just shortly introduce you. Mr. Bot has been the first Dutch ambassador in East Berlin, has been one of his positions. He has also been working as a permanent representation of the Netherlands at the EU and at the NATO. He's also been a Minister of Foreign Affairs during the administrations of Dutch Prime Minister Balkenende. And he has also been a president of the very famous international relations think tank Klingendaal, that does a lot of research on these types of issues. So in sum, Mr. Bot has quite a lot of experience in international politics and has worked with leaders all around the world. So we are very interested in your views on the issue in the current situation in Belarus. But maybe if people also have some other questions, that they are also welcome to ask this. So this for the next 30 minutes, people can ask questions to Mr. Bot. They can do that via YouTube or via the Zoom chat, and I will try to get as much of these questions to Mr. Bot as possible. So I guess you guys can all, whatever you want to ask about the situation, you can, and what we maybe discussed the previous half hour, you can ask, and if not, then maybe I will just ask my first question, because I'm also very eager to to hear about his opinions. But maybe actually, why not just start with the question that was already posed by Joep. So, Mr. Bot, do you think that Lukashenko will step down without an organized militant power that will force him to step down? Do you think that this will happen?
Well, first of all, can you all hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you very well.
Very good. Well, first of all, thank you very much for your kind introduction and for your kind words. It's a great pleasure to participate tonight in this discussion. I understand that this has already been a very lively discussion. I get the impression that all the experts have already answered a lot of questions, but I will try to do my best and add or shed a little light on this extremely complex situation in Belarus. Your question is, as I understand it well, whether he will step down, let's say, in a peaceful way or not. First of all, I think, to give a very short answer, I think that this is not this will not happen very soon. And if I look at situations, for example, in Hong Kong, in Venezuela, and I'm following very actively, what is going on in Venezuela, because of course it's a neighboring country of three of our Caribbean islands. You see that as long as a dictator, such as Mr. Lukashenko, has the support of a powerful neighbor, in this case, Russia, and I don't know what the situation is with China, it is extremely difficult to remove him from power. Of course, let's say many countries have imposed sanctions. The European Union to start with, but also the United Kingdom, Canada, and many other countries. And you see that in spite of all these sanctions, and we have seen the same thing in Hong Kong and Venezuela, people refuse to, let's say, to leave power if they know that they have the support of a big, powerful neighbor. I get here, thank you, on my screen.
No, that's part of the slides. It's not.
But that's all right. You hear me, and
yes.
Yeah, you can see me. That is what is most important. But so, in short, I don't think that he will leave at short notice. I think that it is also not in the interest of the Soviet Union that he will leave at short notice, because let's say the more dependent Mr. Lukashenko becomes on Russia, the better for Mr. Putin. Really has him then in his power. He can manipulate also Belarus as he prefers to do. And I think that is a very bad situation also for Europe.
Yeah, thanks very much. So why do you think it's in the interest of Russia to have this? Is it because it will sort of give a sort of regional balance to the area as well? And I was wondering.
Well, this is a traditional Russian policy. You know that Mr. Putin always still has the ambition to, let's say, to incorporate as many of the neighboring countries as possible, notably Belarus, because it is a very close ally as of old. If you look at the old situation with the Soviet Union, Belarus and Ukraine were, let's say, shall I say, so closely tied to Russia that it was like a sort of a trinity. And you understand, or you can easily understand, that Mr. has great ambitions to restore the old empire. And of course, one of the jewels in this crown would be Belarus. And here he has an ideal chance. Initially, of course, Mr. Lukashenko tried to steer an independent course to, let's say, try to relax that very strong bond with Russia, become closer to the European Union. And we, let's say, now remember also these negotiations we had with Belarus. We tried to incorporate them very slowly into, let's say, all the association agreements, the Eastern neighborhood policy. And we didn't quite manage also because of Mr. Lukashenko, because he himself was not willing, let's say, to bring in human rights in a way that we expect that he observed, say, the human rights situation in Belarus, the rule of law as we see it, that many discussions and we had many exchanges of conferences and views, but it didn't have the result we had hoped. And that, of course, led to a further estrangement. After 2016, it was 2016, we had a brief, let's say, improvement of the situation. And then afterwards, it deteriorated again. And I think that is very bad because we like to have, let's say, free nations on our eastern border. But of course, let's say it needs, well, in this case, three to tango. It needs Russia, it needs Belarus, and it needs the Union in close coordination and cooperation. And at the moment, I think, in spite of all our efforts on the European Union side, we did not manage to bring, let's say, Belarus closer to Europe. And that is, of course, Mr. Lukashenko's fault.
Yeah, thank you very much. I see a question in the chat box. So, what do you think the next steps by the EU should be to resolve this conflict peacefully? Yeah, because as you say, the EU's effort has not really been working in the past. What can we do, or are we just do we just have to stand by? What are our options?
Well, first of all, there's a golden rule in diplomacy, and that is never close the door in negotiations, or however bad the situation, always try to have openings. And I think in this case, what we can do is to try, let's say, informally, to continue the dialogue with Belarus. Yes, I admit that it will be very difficult because once again, it needs also cooperation from the other side. So on the one hand, of course, we have, let's say, more or less reduced our possibilities by imposing all these sanctions. And that means that, let's say, contact with Mr. Lukashenko is very difficult. So I think two things are very important, that we continue the dialogue informally with the regime, but let's say even more important is that we continue the dialogue with the opposition, and that we try to find the people, you know, who really want to restore the situation, the people who best go out into the streets. And I know that the European Union has already introduced a special fund so that we can pay and we can send money, you know, to those people who really need it and who oppose Lukashenko at this juncture. So there's a sort of a two-pronged approach. On the one hand, to keep the door open with Lukashenko. Second, keep the door open, especially, you know, and support the people. Mrs. What's her name? Dictatorship. Who is the one in Lithuania. I think it is very important that we keep contact with her. Third, of course, I think it is important, however difficult, to also continue the dialogue with Putin. I mean, Russia is one of the main players here. And if we manage, let's say, to find a solution, just as we have found, rather as solutions have been found in the Nagorno-Karabakh that also was possible because behind the scenes negotiations went on. And I know that Armenia is not particularly happy about it. It shows that, let's say, diplomacy and negotiations can lead to a result. The worst thing is to let it fester. So for me, my word, let's say, charge in the European Union, I would try to find as many of the opposition, so leaders of the opposition, start with Mr. Tikhanovskaya, to have a very regular contact with her, to ask her advice, and to see how we can support financially, morally, and otherwise all the people in Ukraine, let's say, who are fighting against this regime.
Thank you very much. I have another question from Joop. Will an attempt from the EU to speed up the process of reaching a democratic state be beneficial, or will it only result in more political aggressive reaction from Russia, who wants to slow it down? So yeah, will it backfire, I guess, is what the question is.
Well, I think it's a very appropriate question, and it more or less, let's say, follows on what I was just saying, that if you want to solve the situation, you have to be able to keep contact with all parties concerned, with Russia, with Lukashenko, but especially with the opposition. And as long as, let's say, you manage to get the three, let's say, not together, but at least to find solutions without abandoning, let's say, that is a restoration of human rights, you know, to read, freedom of speech, etc. I think that is essential that we keep insisting but we will not give in as long as these freedoms are not restored. I know it will be difficult, but I have been present at so many negotiations where in the end we always manage to find a solution, often after years. But here, what is important is don't give up. Have a clear view of what you want to accomplish and how you want to accomplish it, and act, let's say, consistently with other nations. And I'm thinking particularly at the moment of the United States, of Great Britain, because, let's say, a concerted action is always more important than an individual action. Now, in the European Union, of course, we are many nations, so we really can make a fist. And more important, we have, as they say, economic power. We can really, with sanctions, punish the regime, but we can always reward it if, let's say, they are willing to go our way and to make, let's say, sizable concessions. And I do not exclude that Lukashenko eventually will understand, and Putin with Lukashenko, that it is better to make a number of concessions and to, let's say, or reinstall freedom of speech, freedom of meeting, and all the important things, the rule of law. But of course, it requires a concerted effort on, how should I say, Western side, and therefore also very curious to see what Mr. Biden, President Biden, is going to do, whether he will join the European Union in its effort, to set up a democratic regime in Belarus.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Another question that is being asked is, do you think it would be good for the European Union to have Belarus as one of their member states?
Well, it's an interesting question. And of course, the answer is clear. That is no at the moment. It would not be good because, let's say, via the back door, you would get Russia into the European Union. As long as Belarus is not an independent democratic nation, as long as it is more or less, let's say, a province of Russia, and that is what it is at the moment, because Lukashenko is so beholden to Putin, he has no other option than to obey his master's wish and to dance, let's say, to the tune of Mr. Putin. I don't think it is good to have that kind of nation inside the European Union. And anyway, I think Russia would not be particularly happy if even negotiations with Belarus would start our membership. I exclude that possibility. Everybody, or every one of you who is familiar with the situation in the European Union and accession negotiations, Serbia, with Balkan countries, know how difficult it is, to come to terms, to find a reasonable solution for membership. Because if, say, we have those Copenhagen criteria, which for many of these countries are very hard to fill, and I think for Belarus it will be practically impossible. And apart from answering the question, will it be possible or will it not be possible, then also the question, of course, does Belarus itself want to become a member of the European Union? Now, I could imagine that if Mrs. Tikhanovskaya, let's say, and her group once in a future moment would be installed as president of Belarus, I can imagine that she would ask for negotiations with the European Union. First, I think, a special partnership and accession agreement, and that we would gradually move towards the direction of membership. In other words, the European Union would not refuse membership. It would, of course, be on the terms of the Copenhagen criteria, and it would be on our terms. And that is something that I see not happen in the near future.
Yes. There is also quite a question that I think basically says that don't you think it's we should sort of have Lukashenko finish his ruling, so that we can so that the EU can sort of think of a more elaborate plan because yes, he thinks that it's impossible now to kick out the president by violence to avoid Russian intervention. So this person believes that people should take time.
Well, first of all, we never kick out people by violence. That goes against all the principles of the European Union. It even goes, I think, against the principles of NATO. No, we should not kick out by violence. I think that if you want to be successful and look at all the successful revolutions in the past, they're only successful if the people, let's say, the population of that particular country itself, let's say, is eager to effectuate.
Yes.
Let's say if there is outward pressure, outside pressure, it never works. I remember a discussion I once had with the Chinese president, and I said, well, how do you manage those relations? And he said, well, if you look at the Chinese history, you will see that we have never conquered nations, but that we always have, let's say, extended our influence to Chinese citizens. We sent citizens to Indonesia, to Thailand, to all the other countries, and we have a much greater influence by having, let's say, important Chinese representatives in those countries. That is much more effective than conquering a country. It always creates trouble. And that is a lesson, he said, which we have learned over many decades, many ages even. And I think that also in this case, removing a dictator, however despicable by power, doesn't work by violence. You have seen what happened in Venezuela when the United States tried, let's say, very, well, how shall I say, kind way to remove Mr. Maduro. That failed totally because he knew that he had the army behind him. And I think the same thing is true at the moment in Belarus. Not only Mr. Putin, but also, let's say, powerful institutions are standing behind Mr. Lukashenko. As long as that is the case, I think we should use the instruments of diplomacy, which are, let's say, amply available. And many people think with great patience work at a transfer of power. That way, I think, and I'm very positive as far as the opposition is concerned. I admire them, what they do. And I think that eventually that will lead to changes. Perhaps not as substantial as we wish them, but I think that they will certainly lead to, first of all, modest changes, and gradually, perhaps, that will also become a more democratic nation.
Yeah, thank you. The next question is, maybe I can combine them. So the first one is what do you think the influence of Biden, that you already mentioned, will be? And the other one is also, don't you think that maybe it's also good to look at the NATO and what they can do, and not only focus on the European level? So yeah.
From this election, and we are absolutely sure that Mr. Biden can assume full presidential powers. I think that that is, first of all, very important, because at the moment he has some things to do, let's say, inside the United States before he can pay attention to these external situations. I think that NATO should stay out of this question. I think it would be only detrimental. And I think it would also be munition for Putin to say that, you see what is happening, let's say, NATO at the borders of Russia, that is totally unacceptable. That would be, it would be cause for war, because that is going too far. But he certainly would, let's say, protest very strongly against any interference by NATO. We've seen this already at the time when the two Germanys joined and, say, merged, so to speak, and had the famous Baker concessions, supposedly, say that also the three, Lithuania and so on, would never join either NATO or the European Union, and see what happened. And each time I also talk here to Russians, they tell me, you agree to certain things and say that this will never happen. And the next thing you do is you make all of these three countries, members of the European Union and of NATO. So I think Belarus and NATO, we should, for the time being, say.
Mr. Bolt, I believe I believe that your video was lagging, so we couldn't hear you. Could you maybe repeat the last sentence that you said?
Yes, and no, I said that we should avoid NATO, let's say, coming into the game. I think that would be detrimental to, let's say, the process, which would be much more effective, under the guidance of the European Union, perhaps with the United States on the side, but not via NATO.
Yeah, perfect. That's very clear.
Can you now hear me?
Yes, we can hear you very well. Another interesting question is, do you expect any interesting democracy movements in autocracies, apart from the ones you have talked about already? So I guess in other countries, I would say. Yes. Do you expect any other democratic movements that might happen in the future, aside from Belarus? Is I believe the question.
Well, I think one of the first candidates would be Russia, of course. We hope that we would see such movement. Unfortunately, at the moment that everywhere in the world there is a sort of tendency towards strong leadership, and now I express myself very quietly, in the sense that, let's say, in many countries, obviously, also populations like strong leaders. You see that, for example, in Hungary, you see it in Poland, you see it in China, Russia, Venezuela, in other words, Philippines, everywhere in the world. I think this is a very dangerous tendency because it undermines our democracy and our democratic rights. It undermines the human rights situation. But for one mysterious reason or another, many populations keep voting for those dictators. I was surprised.
Also Russia?
Russia, yeah. But also, let's say, if you look at what is going on in the Philippines, where people continue voting, for hardline as Mr. Duterte. What happens in Brazil, Mr. Bolsonaro, who is kept in power. And if you look at Hungary, we can say a lot of things about democracy, etc. But as my Hungarian friends pointed out, let's say the leader is elected by 70% of the population. And in a vote where 70% of the people are coming to vote, which is quite exceptional. In other words, they like what Mr. Orban is doing. And they like what Mr. Kaczynski is doing in Poland. And I think those are things we have to watch very carefully as democracies, that we are not slowly giving in to the wish, let's say, to have a strong man for, shorter or longer period to set things straight, as people also believe that Mr. Trump will do. And it's obviously more than 70 million Americans still believe, let's say, that is the right way to act. And I think that also is so dangerous, because leaders start believing themselves that they are the only ones who can set the record. And I think that is also what happens in Belarus at the moment. Mr. Lukashenko really believes that he is the only one who is good for the country, is good because he has good relations with Russia. So the economy is good for the overall situation. But it is a dangerous tendency, and I think we all have to be very careful that this is not happening also within our European Union.
Thank you very much. This is also a very interesting question. It's a bit more less related to the situation of Belarus, but more about your career. So the question is, during your career, what was the most difficult problem in politics that you've encountered, and how did you solve it?
Well, I think one of the most difficult problems was, well, one, when I was Minister for Foreign Affairs, it was the decision whether we would, let's say, get engaged in Afghanistan and send troops there. That really more than a year of very intensive discussions with the United States, with Australia, with Canada, with other partners there, because it meant engaging many of our troops and in very, let's say, insecure circumstances. That was an extremely difficult decision to take. I think the same thing was, I remember when I was a permanent representative in Brussels and discussed the situation in Eastern Europe, whether we would start negotiations with these countries with full membership, or whether the time was not yet ripe, to start negotiations. I remember how intensive the preliminaries were before we finally started the actual negotiating process. Not because we didn't like the countries, but because many people believe that they were not yet ready to be members of this very complex European Union. But in the end, I think also under the pressure of Germany and France, and we all were convinced that this was inevitable, that we had to help these countries, that we had to engage them and to bring them into that European community. And I think the same question at the moment arises in respect to countries. They all have the promise that one day, they will be members. The negotiations are extremely complex, and I assisted and attended and negotiated almost all of the accession agreement. And I remember how intricate and how complex these negotiations were, how often we had to jump over our own shadow to say, okay, in fact, they are not yet quite ready, but let them in because that is good for them. It's in the end good for us, it's good for democracy and for cohesion, European cohesion and cooperation. And I think we succeeded there. And well, one of you asked, about Belarus becoming a member of the European Union. You can never exclude it. I am always for enlargement. I do not belong to those who say the European Union is finished, we have enough members. I think that the European Union can always use a few more, in other words, to have a common market of more than 500 or 600 million members, especially if you take into account the power of China with 1 billion, 300 million or 400 million. We need a European Union that is not only a strong trading bloc, and I think we are still the strongest trading bloc in the world, but you also need volume. And volume you only get by many countries and many people.
Thank you very much. I believe that those were pretty much all the questions that were asked. I want to thank you very much for all your very interesting answers today. I was wondering maybe if the board that organized this wanted to finish with something or nothing.
Well, first of all, I think that it's fantastic that you organize such a, what is it, a symposium or a meeting.
Yeah.
I think it's very useful, let's say, that you discuss among yourselves these essential questions of democracy, and how will we as European Union maintain a high standard of democracy. I think that is essential because we see it slipping away, in some countries. And you see, and that is why I, a few moments ago, pointed out how dangerous how dangerous I think it is to have these strong men in countries, sort of exemplary leaders. They are not, and in the end, they will ruin democracy. They will ruin everything we have constructed carefully over many decades. That is, of course, up to you, the new generation, to see to it that these democratic rights are respected. And I think that we can all do that together, but especially the young people, remain engaged and not say, okay, it is for an older generation, let them arrange and troubles and problems. So I think that this kind of seminar which you organized today is extremely useful, and please continue to do it, and to inspire people, especially in this very difficult period. So I admire very much what you are doing, the way you are asking your questions, which I enjoyed very much. And I would have liked, of course, to have an even longer session, vis-a-vis, where we will have really seen all of you. Because that's always the best way to engage in such a dialogue.